You've shamed the clan!
Those words still burned against her skin when Seren crossed the last trees along the road and felt the cold afternoon wind brush her face. All of it had happened because she was too kind to ignore the animals nobody wanted, too kind to pretend the rejected ones did not deserve shelter, food, and care. When the shelter was discovered, she received no honor for protecting the forgotten. She received ingratitude. She received humiliation. She did not answer. She did not ask for explanations. She did not beg. She simply kept walking with the tired dignity of someone who had already lost too much to fall apart in front of everyone. It was on the way back, with the humiliation still lodged in her throat, that she heard the river. It was not the ordinary sound of running water. It was something else. An uneven dragging, a choked struggle, almost a plea. Seren ran to the bank and saw the white wolf being carried by the current, her heavy belly revealing that she was pregnant and far too close to the limit to fight alone. Seren did not think. She stepped into the water without hesitation. The river was icy and violent, pulling at her legs, shoving her body, trying to tear away whatever courage she had left. But she reached the wolf, gripped her soaked fur, and fought the current with everything she still had. When she finally managed to drag the animal to the bank, she was breathless, covered in mud and freezing water, but still standing. That was when she saw the collar. The symbol engraved in the metal was too rare to forget. Far away, in the black stone castle of the north, the Alpha King felt the tightness in his chest before he understood why. It was not pain. Not exactly. It was worse than that. It was the sudden feeling that something important had changed beyond his reach. He stood perfectly still for a moment, staring out the open window as if the wind might bring an answer. But it did not. Only silence. And somewhere between the river, the forest, and the throne, fate had just begun to move. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The first sound of the morning in the shelter was Ember trying, for the 17th time that week, to climb Lady Frost. Lady Frost was a snowy owl with ancient feathers and absolutely zero patience. Ember was a 4-month-old wolf pup the color of dying coals, with ears that hadn't yet agreed on a final size and enough energy to violate several laws of physics. The owl spread her wings with a sharp crack, launched the pup back onto the moss, and closed her eyes again with the dignity of someone who stopped being surprised by things a very long time ago. Ember landed on her belly, shook her ears, and tried again. Seren watched from the chamber entrance, mug of tea in hand, smiling before she decided to. You know, Sissa appeared beside her with the second mug. If they ever find this place, you go from Omega of service straight to Omega of how did she build all this while nobody was paying attention. That's a lot of title. Every word earned. Sissa gestured into the chamber where Mira, a 3-legged gray wolf, slept curled against Pip, a bush dog the old clan had discarded for insufficient bloodline. Where Bolde, a 1-eared dwarf bull, grazed with impressive solemnity in the corner. Where 13 other exiled, orphaned, or disabled animals breathed the warm air of a place someone had decided they deserved to have. 17 lives, Seren. What happens if Morbas sends scouts to this ridge? Seren took a slow sip. She watched Ember recalculate her approach, going under the wings this time, which was geometrically worse but creatively respectable. Don't joke about that, she said, and her voice shifted without effort, going quieter, steadier. They are my life. A real silence between them. Then, inevitably, Ember made it under the wings, reached Lady Frost's shoulder, and planted herself there with the expression of someone who has just claimed a continent. The owl opened her eyes, looked directly at Seren. The look said, plainly, Handle this or I won't be held responsible. At least, said Sissa, fighting a losing battle against a smile, it'd make a great story, from exile. Perfect. I'll tell it barefoot, probably. They both laughed at the same time, that specific kind of laugh that lives just below fear, not quite joy but necessary, the kind that keeps people standing when the subject is too heavy to carry without a breath of air. The vibration came through the floor before it became sound. Seren felt it in her feet first, the frequency of heavy boots, more than usual, from the direction of the North Ridge. Mira lifted her head from sleep at the exact same moment. Two pairs of eyes met. Sissa. Already heard it. Sissa had her ear to the crack in the north wall. She pulled back with that expression. Dran. At least 6 with him. And torches. Torches in the morning. Not a routine patrol. Seren didn't panic. She breathed, leveled, and started solving. South route. Dry creek bed to the ravine. You know the way. I do, but it's 17 animals, and Ember is still on the owl's shoulder. Ember. She used the specific tone. The pup came down. Not immediately, but she came down. The next 20 minutes were the most organized chaos Seren had ever produced. Ember tucked under her arm, kicking with all 4 legs because she couldn't understand why the adventure had to be quiet. Lady Frost flat out refusing the transport basket on principle, choosing to fly instead, and landing on Seren's shoulder every 50 yards like it was a matter of personal integrity. Mira keeping pace, steady on 3 legs. Pip and the bush dogs falling into single file because they had learned that a line means a plan, and a plan means Seren knows what she's doing. Boldy stopped at the entrance of the south route and stared into the dark with the expression of someone carefully reviewing a proposal. Seren stopped in front of him, held his gaze. That quiet, direct look that said, I know you have opinions and we're going anyway. Bolda exhaled with the full weight of a creature that has thoughts and has learned when to keep them to himself, and walked in. How do you do that? Sissa murmured, slipping past him. No idea. Works on bulls. Never worked on Morbus. Stop. I can't laugh right now. That's exactly the problem. They heard Dran's voice echo from inside the chambers, finding the empty shelter, finding the bandages and medicines and shelving, finding everything. Seren didn't stop to listen. She kept moving, leading 17 animals through the darkness of the south route, toward the ravine, toward the eastern frontier, toward the lands no one entered because they were considered dead since the great drought generations back. No one knew anything concrete about them because no one had bothered to check. Seren had checked. A year earlier, out of the kind of caution people call excessive, and that is actually just clarity about how fragile good things can be. The lands weren't dead. They were sleeping. There was water, roots, and the quiet of a place the world had forgotten, which meant, by some mercy, they still had the texture of something untouched. A week later, with Sissa settled and the animals beginning to understand the new territory, Seren went back. There was no elaborate plan. Just a simple need to know whether there was an active search, whether Sissa was safe in the clan, whether there was a window to get more supplies. Knowing, for her, had always been worth the cost of going to see. She entered the village through the market road at dusk, hood low, pace steady. The oldest trick in the world. It worked for 4 minutes. The 5th was when Dran recognized her. He didn't say anything at first. He just pointed, and the whole village turned. Seren stood in the center of the market square while the voices came in layers. Many mouths saying similar things at the same time, forming that collective sound that doesn't require individual cruelty to be cruel. Get out. Don't come back. Spent years lying to our faces, hiding what she was doing. Chose to protect what the clan rejected. Like her judgment matters more than the law. Filth. Doesn't belong anywhere. That last one, doesn't belong anywhere, came from a direction she couldn't identify, and it was the one that stayed. Not because it was the harshest, because of the specific note of certainty in it. The tone of someone stating a geographic fact. Someone threw a handful of dirt. Missed. But the gesture opened a door. Elder Morbas appeared at the edge of the square with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who made the decision long ago and is only now making it official. His presence alone was enough to tell the crowd they were on the right side. "You are not welcome here," he said, and the square went quiet to hear it. Not today, not ever again. Seren kept her hands still, chin level. She turned her back slowly, because running would give them something they hadn't earned, and walked, step by step, spine straight. Only when the last house of the village fell behind her and the forest path swallowed the noise did she stop. She pressed her back against a wide oak and stayed there, just breathing, not crying, because that kind of pain doesn't cry right away. It goes still. It settles. It comes back weeks later at unexpected moments when someone says a word that shouldn't mean anything. She stayed as long as she needed, lifted her head, adjusted her hood, and kept going. That was when she heard the river. The creek at the base of the eastern ridge was running dark and fast from the week's rain, and the sound that reached Seren's ears came from inside the water. Low, exhausted, unmistakably alive. She moved to the bank and saw the wolf. White coat with gray patches, large, being pulled sideways by the current with her legs working without gaining ground. Belly heavy, instinctively guarded from the rocks. Pregnant. Very pregnant. Seren processed all of it in 2 seconds, pulled off her hood, dropped her bag, looked at the current, and told herself with the honesty that only exists when no one is watching. This is the worst idea I've had all day. And stepped into the river. The water was cold with a purpose of its own. The current hit her immediately, trying to turn her into one more problem. She used every rock she felt under her feet, pushed against the force of the water, kept her eyes on the wolf who had hit a jutting boulder and stopped moving, which was not a good sign. She reached her, put her hands on the wolf's back, and felt the muscle tremors, the exhaustion, the enormous weight of that belly. The wolf turned her head, yellow eyes, deep, completely spent, and for a moment just looked at her. "You can distrust me all you want later," said Seren. "Right now, we're moving." What followed was, objectively, the most graceless rescue operation of her life. The current shoved them in opposite directions. The wolf weighed more than anything Seren had carried. She slipped on the riverbed rocks twice, the second time going shoulders deep into the freezing water with a smothered yelp that almost certainly disturbed every living creature within a solid radius. Recovered. Lost her footing. Recovered again. When she finally dragged the wolf onto the shallow bank and both of them collapsed together in the mud, Seren was soaked to the bone and had lost one sandal to the current, at some point she couldn't precisely identify. The wolf looked at her with those spent yellow eyes. "Don't say a word," said Seren. She stayed there catching her breath, and then, examining the animal with hands still shaking from the cold, she saw the collar. Worked metal, an engraved symbol she had seen exactly once before, on a banner the wind had carried from the wrong direction years ago. The seal of the Northern Kingdom. The seal of Alpha King Uldren Voss. 300 miles north, in the black stone castle rising over the tidal peak, Alpha King Uldren had been standing on the east balcony for 3 solid hours, and his advisors had long since learned to work quietly when he got like this. Pero, his general, 40 years old, scar on his jaw, 10 years of professional resignation, approached with the latest report. "The southern trackers still haven't checked in, Your Majesty." Uldren didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the southern horizon, arms crossed, that specific tension in his shoulders that Pero recognized, not anger yet, but the room right next to it. "She never disappears," Uldren said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. "Nara has never disappeared, not once in 15 years. Pero waited. "She's 2 weeks from delivery." The king's amber eyes swept the horizon like they could reach past it. If the eastern creek flooded with the rain and she tried to cross... Uldren. Pero rarely used the name. The king turned. We'll find her. For a moment, Uldren looked at him without the layer of authority, without the political calculation. Just a man concerned about something he had chosen to love. Since the night a wounded pup finally accepted food from his hand after 6 nights of refusing. Nara wasn't a symbol of the kingdom. She was proof that some loyalties are built slowly and hold forever. I want every available tracker mobilized by dawn, he said, and his voice had recovered the command, but something underneath it hadn't gone anywhere. And Pero. The amber eyes fixed on the southern horizon with a precision Pero knew well. If someone found her before we did. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. On the muddy bank of the eastern creek, the king's pregnant wolf was breathing slowly in the hands of the exiled Omega. And neither of them knew yet what that meeting was going to cost, or what it was going to be worth. Nara had opinions. Seren discovered this approximately 4 minutes after the rescue, when she tried to help the wolf stand, and Nara turned her head with the deliberate slowness of someone who has decided to get a good look at the person touching them before cooperating with anything. The yellow eyes were exhausted, but sharp, cataloging, the kind of gaze that doesn't ask permission and doesn't offer apology. Take your time, said Seren, still dripping, 1 foot in a sandal and 1 foot in the mud. It's not like we're running out of daylight or anything. Nara looked at her for 3 more seconds, then stood. Not easily. Her legs shook with the effort and her belly swung heavy beneath her. But she stood with the particular dignity of a creature that refuses to look weak in front of strangers, which Seren found deeply relatable. She wasn't entirely sure the wolf was okay. The breathing was labored. The left foreleg favored where the current had driven her into the boulder. Bruised deep, not broken, Seren assessed from the weight distribution. And the faint tremors running through Nara's flank every few minutes were not from the cold water. Those were contractions. Seren closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Of course they are, she said. She opened them. Looked at the sky doing that particular late afternoon thing where the light turns copper and apologetic, as if the sun already knows it's about to abandon you. 2 hours of daylight, maybe less. 40 minutes to the border on a good day, and this was not a good day by any measurable standard. She had 1 sandal, a soaked bag, and a royal wolf in active pre-labor who was watching her with the expression of someone who hasn't decided whether to trust her yet, but has run out of better options. Here's what's going to happen, said Seren, wringing a river's worth of water from her bag strap. I walk. You walk beside me. We both act like this is completely normal until we get somewhere safe. Deal? Nara didn't respond verbally. She fell into step beside her, close beside her, their shoulders nearly touching, which was not standard wolf behavior with strangers. Seren noted it and filed it without comment. Not a word, she said anyway. The walk took 1 hour and 10 minutes instead of 40. Nara stopped every 8 to 12 minutes when a contraction came, planting her feet and breathing through it with her eyes forward and her jaw set. Seren stopped with her every time without being asked, not touching, just present, close enough to be useful. She had learned a long time ago that some creatures don't want to be held through the hard parts. They just want someone nearby who isn't panicking. Seren was not panicking. She was performing extremely detailed internal calculations about how much trouble she was in, which is a different thing entirely. I want you to know, she said during the 3rd stop, that I'm very good at this. Animal births. I've done 11 of them. 12 if you count the time with the river otter, which I partially count and partially choose not to think about. Nara's ear rotated toward her, the wolf equivalent of go on. The otter was fine, said Seren. Eventually. There were complications in the middle that I will not be describing right now because I need you calm, not informed. The ear rotated back forward. Smart, said Seren. They crossed the border as the last copper light left the sky, stepping from the packed earth of the old territory into the softer ground of the sleeping lands. And Seren felt, as she always did, the faint shift in the air. Cooler, quieter. Like stepping into a room where the noise of the world doesn't quite reach. Nara felt it too. Her step changed, not slower, but more deliberate, the way animals move when something registers below the level of sound. I know, said Seren. It's strange the first time, but it's not dangerous. Or, well, it hasn't been dangerous yet, which I'm choosing to count as a positive track record. Sissa saw them coming from 50 yards out and had the specific reaction of someone whose day had already been eventful and just discovered it wasn't done with them. She stood at the shelter entrance, a wide, low cave Seren had expanded with 3 weeks of excavation, and stared at the wolf walking beside Seren with the focused attention of someone building a list of problems in real time. Seren? I know. That is a very large, very pregnant wolf. I'm aware. Is that... Sissa's voice dropped. Is that a royal collar? I said I know. You rescued the king's wolf. I rescued a wolf from a flooding river. The king part was a detail I discovered afterward. Sissa looked at her, looked at Nara, looked at Seren's one sandal, looked back at Nara. You lost a shoe. The river kept it. I didn't have a vote. Seren. Sissa pressed both hands flat against her own face, breathed and lowered them with the composure of someone who has decided the situation is absurd enough to require a completely different approach. How long until she delivers? Hours. Maybe less. That snapped Sissa into motion. She disappeared and came back with dry blankets, the medicine bag, and water, moving with the efficient quiet that comes from years of operating in spaces where things needed doing without discussion. She spread the blankets in the warmest corner of the shelter entrance without looking at Nara for permission, which was exactly the right instinct. Nara watched her, didn't protest, and lowered herself onto the blankets with the careful deliberateness of an animal that has decided to accept help and has committed to the decision. Ember appeared from inside the shelter, spotted Nara, and stopped dead. The pup sat down on the spot, ears at full extension, and stared with the total absence of social filter that only the very young can achieve without consequence. Nara looked at her. Ember looked back. Then sneezed, startled herself, fell sideways, recovered, and immediately pretended none of it had happened. Nara's expression didn't change, but something around her eyes did. Very slightly, the way a door opens a crack before anyone decides to open it. Don't let that fool you, Seren told the wolf. She's like this with everyone. It passes. It did not historically pass, but this was not the moment for full disclosure. The births came in waves across 3 hours. 5 pups, each one arriving with the particular drama of new things entering the world. Loud, then suddenly quiet, then loud again in a different register. Nara was extraordinary throughout. Not easy, because nothing about it was easy, but present and focused and accepting Seren's hands during the hardest moments with a trust that felt earned rather than automatic. By the time the 5th pup was breathing and nursing, the fire Sissa had built at the entrance had burned to steady coals, and the sleeping lands had gone fully dark around them. Pressing in soft and close, the way darkness does in places that have been quiet for a long time. Seren sat back on her heels and let herself exhale. All 5. All breathing. Nara's head was down, eyes half closed, flank rising and falling with the deep rhythm of an animal that has done something enormous and is now resting with everything it has. Sissa sat cross-legged beside the coals and said nothing for a moment. Then, 5. Is that significant? In the Northern Kingdom, said Seren, keeping her voice even, 5 pups born to a royal wolf is called the 5-fold promise. It shows up in their succession records. I know that because I spent a lot of time in the clan library reading about wolf lineages when I was 11 and had no friends. Sissa looked at her. The social commentary is not necessary right now. I didn't say anything. You were thinking it loudly. Nara opened her eyes at that moment and looked directly at Seren. There was something in them that hadn't been there on the riverbank. Not exhaustion, not relief. Something that looked, uncomfortably, like recognition. Like she had known exactly where she was going when the current brought her to that bank. Seren held the look for a moment. Don't read into it, she told herself. She wasn't sure she believed that. 300 miles north, in the Blackstone Castle above the tidal peak, a knock came at the war room door at the second hour past midnight. Pero entered without ceremony. He had the expression he reserved for news that doesn't benefit from softening. The trackers reached the eastern creek. They found her trail on the south bank. She came out of the water. Uldren was on his feet before Pero finished the sentence. Someone helped her. 2 sets of prints leaving the bank together. Nara's and a smaller set. Pero paused, barefoot on one side. A silence filled the room with a specific quality, the kind before a decision that won't be walked back. Where does the trail lead? East, past the frontier, into the dead lands. Uldren was already at the door. Get my horse. Just you and me, Pero. Nobody else. Pero had known him long enough to recognize the difference between Uldren the king moving toward a political situation and Uldren the man moving toward something that mattered to him in a way that had nothing to do with politics. This was the second one. He went to get the horse. Somewhere in the sleeping lands, 5 new lives breathed their first night into the dark, and the man riding to find them had no idea that the woman who saved them had nowhere left to run. Seren had not slept. She'd tried. She'd arranged herself against the shelter wall, closed her eyes, and immediately run into the wall of her own thoughts, which were significantly less cooperative than the wolf she had assisted through labor 4 hours earlier. Every time she got close to sleep, her brain presented a fresh angle on the same problem, like a very dedicated attorney making a very bad case. Royal wolf, 5 pups, trackers mobilized, exiled status, 1 sandal. She gave up around the 3rd hour and just watched. Nara slept. The 5 pups slept against her warmth in a pile that had no real logic to it beyond proximity. Ember had crept close sometime in the night and was now asleep approximately 3 inches from the nearest pup, nose tucked under her own tail, either the most trusting thing she'd ever done or the most oblivious. And with Ember, the line was hard to draw. Outside, the sleeping lands breathed in their particular way. Not silent. There was wind in the upper canopy, the low sound of the water source to the east, the occasional rustle of something small navigating the dark. But the quality of it was different from the territory she'd left. Lighter, less weighted. She was still looking at the pups when Sissa appeared with 2 mugs and sat down beside her. You look like you've been doing math. Bad math. How bad? We can't run. Nara can't travel. The pups definitely can't travel. Seren accepted the mug. And when the trackers arrive, they're going to find a woman with 1 sandal and an exiled status hovering over the king's newborn litter in a location that doesn't officially exist. When you say it like that, it sounds exactly as bad as it is. Sissa wrapped both hands around her mug. They looked at Nara together, who had opened one eye, assessed the situation, and closed it again with the calm of someone who has decided that whatever comes next is someone else's problem to worry about. She trusts you, said Sissa. She trusted me because she had no other options. Maybe. Sissa was quiet for a moment. Or maybe she's been around enough people to know the difference between someone who helps because they want something and someone who helps because they simply can't not. Seren didn't answer. She looked at the pups. Small, pale, breathing with the deep unconscious trust of things that are new to the world and haven't learned yet to be afraid of it. Something in her chest did the thing it always did with new animals. The immediate, unconditional investment in whether they made it. It had never once been a choice. It had also never once caused her anything but trouble. "How's Bolda handling the new arrivals?" she asked, because sometimes the only way to deal with a large feeling is to talk about something smaller. He walked over at dawn, studied the pups for a long moment, and returned to his corner to continue grazing. He approved? He didn't disapprove. For Bolde, that's practically a standing ovation. The trackers arrived at noon. Seren heard them first. 2 sets of footsteps, deliberate and controlled, the kind trained to cover ground without announcing themselves. They were good. Not good enough to mask from someone who had spent 3 years listening for exactly this approach, but good. She was standing at the shelter entrance when they stepped out of the tree line. 2 men, leather armor, northern insignia, faces professionally composed to reveal nothing. Sissa appeared quietly at the back of the shelter, said nothing, and stayed there, present, watching, one hand resting on Bolda's flank with the stillness of someone who has decided that her job right now is to not escalate anything. The taller tracker's eyes moved past Seren immediately, found Nara in the shelter behind her, and everything in his posture shifted in one breath, from operational to something entirely more personal. "Is she—" he started. "She's fine. 5 pups, all healthy. Bruised foreleg from the current, needs monitoring for a week. She ate this morning. She slept." Seren kept her voice even. "She's fine." The taller tracker stared at her. "Who are you?" said the shorter one, someone who was at the river at the right time. "Name: Seren Valda." The shorter tracker's expression didn't change much. Just a small tightening at the eyes that she recognized, the micro-adjustment of someone who has been given a name to watch for and has just heard it spoken by the person themselves. The Eastern clans filed a notice, exiled Omega, considered, "I know what it says." "Then you understand we have an obligation to—" "You have an obligation," said Seren, with a steadiness that surprised even her, "to report to your king that his wolf and her 5 pups are alive. What you do after that is your business." From inside the shelter, Nara raised her head and looked directly at the 2 trackers. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't a threat. It was simply the look of an animal that has decided which side of a situation she's on, and is making that clear without raising her voice. The specific physical response that moved through both trackers at that moment was below the level of thought. The slight backward shift of weight, the unconscious lowering of the shoulders, the particular quality of attention that Nara carried like a second coat, demanding acknowledgement from something older than rank. The shorter tracker looked at Nara, looked at Seren, looked at Nara again. "We need to send word to the king," he said. "Send it. He'll come himself." I assumed. "And when he arrives, I'll be here." Her voice was flat and simple. Where else would I go? That landed. She could see it land. The plain logic of a woman with no clan, no territory, a litter that couldn't be moved for 3 days, and 1 sandal. The tracker nodded once, reached for the message case at his belt, and stepped back to write. Seren turned back into the shelter and crouched beside Nara. She pressed 2 fingers gently to the wolf's jaw, a contact she used with animals that needed grounding, not comfort. Something that said, "I'm here," without promising anything she couldn't guarantee. Nara's eyes closed briefly. Not submission, just acknowledgement. "Don't worry," Seren said, too low for anyone else to hear. "I'm not going anywhere." The low rumble that moved through Nara's chest was not a growl. From the back of the shelter, Sissa caught Serene's eye over Bolda's flank. Her expression said several things simultaneously, chief among them. "I have a lot of thoughts about this, and I'm choosing to save them for later." Seren gave her a small nod that said, "Appreciated." 40 miles south, moving at a pace his trackers had learned not to comment on, the Alpha King of the Northern Kingdom received a message that answered 1 question and opened 17 more. ending with a line the tracker had added in careful, slightly uncertain script, as if he wasn't sure it was relevant but felt it probably was. Seren Valda, exiled Omega, Eastern clans, one sandal. She saved them. Uldren read it twice, then a third time. Then he looked up at the tree line ahead and said nothing for a long moment. Pero, riding beside him, also said nothing. He had learned, over 10 years, exactly when silence was the correct response. This was one of those times. Uldren rode into the sleeping lands at mid-afternoon and immediately understood why nobody came here. Not because it was dangerous, because it was the kind of quiet that makes people feel like they're intruding on something that was doing perfectly fine without them. The quality of a place that has its own rhythm and is politely uninterested in yours. The trees were older here. The light came through the canopy at a different angle. Even his horse slowed without being asked, stepping more carefully, as if the ground deserved the consideration. Pero rode beside him and said nothing, which meant he felt it too, and had decided it wasn't a threat. After 10 years, Pero's silences were a reliable diagnostic tool. The tracker who had sent the report met them at the eastern edge of the shelter clearing. He looked, Uldren noted, like a man who had spent the last 3 hours slightly unsure of his professional footing, which was unusual for a tracker of his caliber and interesting enough to file away. "The wolf is stable," he said. "Hapro, the pups are healthy. The woman," he paused with the micro-hesitation of someone choosing words carefully, "is cooperative." "Cooperative," Uldren repeated. "She hasn't left. She's been with the litter since we arrived." "The wolf," he paused again, "doesn't seem to want her to leave." Uldren looked at him. "Nara doesn't want her to leave." "No, Your Majesty." Uldren dismounted, handed the reins to Pero, and walked toward the shelter entrance. He smelled wood smoke first, then the specific warm scent of a space that had been lived in, animals and herbs and something that was probably food at some earlier point in the day. Then he heard a voice, low and even, coming from inside. "You have to stop looking at me like that. I don't have more food. I gave you the last of it an hour ago, and giving you the look is not going to change the physics of the situation." A pause. "I see you. The look is not working. I want to be very clear that the look is not—" A sound that was unmistakably a very large animal making a very small, very pointed noise. "Fine. Half. But this is the last time." Uldren stepped into the shelter entrance. She was crouched beside Nara with her back to the entrance, one hand resting on the wolf's flank, dividing what appeared to be a piece of dried meat with the focused fairness of a diplomat negotiating a treaty. The 5 pups were a pile of pale fur against Nara's side. A 3-legged gray wolf slept in the far corner. A 1-eared bull stood in the middle of the space with the sovereign calm of someone who owns the property. An owl was on a rock shelf and appeared to be judging everyone present equally. The woman was barefoot on one foot. The other wore a sandal. She turned when she heard him, stood in one motion, which brought her to roughly his shoulder height, and looked at him with dark eyes that did the same thing Nara's had done when they'd first met. Cataloging, assessing, not asking permission for either. Then her gaze moved to the insignia on his coat, back to his face. And something in her expression did a very fast, very controlled recalibration that he recognized because he'd done it himself, in rooms where the person walking through the door changed the nature of every available option. Her eyes met his. She noticed, before he could hide it, that he had been watching her for longer than necessary just to identify her. "Your Majesty," she said. Not a question, not a greeting exactly. Just an acknowledgement that the situation had formally changed. "Seren Valda," he said. "That's what the notice says." "I didn't bring the notice." "No." She held his gaze steadily. "But you know what it says." He did. He had read the Eastern clan's filing on the ride over. Exiled Omega, 3 years of documented insubordination, violation of the lineage decree, fled before council judgment. A neat case built by people who were very good at making things look inevitable. He looked at Nara. Nara looked back at him with those yellow eyes, and he felt, as he always did, the specific relief of her being alive. 15 years of it compressed into one breath. 5 small shapes tucked against her flank, all breathing. He crossed the shelter in 4 strides, crouched beside her, and put his hand on her head. Nara pressed into it with the weight she always used, the particular pressure that meant you took too long to get here, but I'll allow it. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." He stayed like that for a moment. When he stood, Seren realized she had been holding her breath. She didn't know why. She despised herself for it. Then he looked at the pups, one by one, with the counting focus of a man who had been told 5, but needed to confirm it himself. 5. All of them pale, all of them moving with the small, unconscious intensity of things that are new and already want things. He became aware, in the peripheral way of someone whose attention is divided, that the woman behind him had not moved, had not spoken, and was giving him the room to have this moment without making it complicated. That was not a small thing. He stood and turned. "The foreleg," he said. "Bruised, not broken. She needs rest and limited movement for a week, ideally 10 days. The delivery was textbook difficult. She was in the water too long. The contractions were already advanced when I got her out. But she managed well." A pause. "She manages everything well." "She does." He looked at the woman directly. "How long have you been here, in these lands?" 8 days. "Alone?" "My friend Sissa is here, and—" She gestured at the shelter's various inhabitants. 17 others, depending on how you count. His eyes moved across the space again. The 3-legged wolf, the 1-eared bull, the owl, a small wolf pup the color of coals, currently attempting to climb the bull's leg with the optimism of someone who has never once succeeded at this and sees no reason to stop trying. "These are the animals from the shelter," he said, not a question. She went very still. "You know about the shelter." The Eastern clan's notice was detailed. He watched her face. "You built it over 3 years. You hid it under the ridge. You evacuated it in under 30 minutes before the scouts arrived. 22 minutes. He looked at her. Something at the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but in the vicinity. 22 minutes, he said. With 17 animals, including— He looked at the bull. "That. Bolda has opinions about scheduling. We've reached an understanding." Clearly, from the corner, Boldy regarded Uldren with the calm of someone who is reserving judgment, but is in no particular hurry about it. The owl rearranged her feathers with pointed deliberateness. The pup at Bolda's leg, having failed the climb, sat down and stared at Uldren instead. "That one," said Uldren. "Ember. 4 months. She does that to everyone. It passes." "Does it?" "No, but I find it helpful to say." This time it was unambiguous. The corner of his mouth became a real thing, brief, involuntary, the kind that arrives before the person decides to allow it. Nara made a low sound from her blankets. Both of them looked at her. She was looking at Uldren with the expression he knew well, the one that wasn't a request exactly, but communicated a preference with enough clarity that the distinction barely mattered. "She wants you to stay," said Seren, and her voice was neutral, just observation. "I know what she wants." He looked back at Seren. "What I don't know is what you want." The question landed differently than he intended. He could see it in the slight shift of her weight, not discomfort, but the adjustment of someone who hadn't expected to be asked. "I want the pups to be safe until they can travel," she said finally. "That's the immediate answer." "And the rest of the answer?" She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Nara, at the pups. At the space around them, the shelter that shouldn't exist in lands that weren't supposed to support life, the animals that weren't supposed to have survived, the fire that was still burning. "I'll tell you the rest of the answer," she said, "when I've figured out what it is." It was, Uldren thought, possibly the most honest thing anyone had said to him in a very long time. Pero appeared at the shelter entrance behind him, looking between his king and the barefoot woman with the neutral expression of a man taking very careful mental notes. "Your Majesty, the trackers have set a perimeter. We're secure for the night." "Good." Uldren didn't look away from Seren. "We're staying." Pero absorbed this. "All of us. All of us." Pero's gaze moved briefly to Bolde, who was still watching him with sovereign calm, to the owl, who was still judging, to Ember, who had abandoned Bolde's leg and was now sitting directly on Pero's boot and looking up at him with enormous, expectant eyes. "Right," said Pero, with the composure of a man who has handled worse. "I'll let the men know." Uldren was still looking at her when the fire crackled between them. She didn't look away first. Neither did he. Someone would have to give in eventually. Neither seemed willing to be the first. Dinner that night was a quiet, strange, unexpectedly ordinary thing. Fire at the entrance, animals settled, the king of the Northern Territory eating dried provisions on the floor of a cave in lands that weren't supposed to exist, next to a woman with one sandal who talked to a bull like he had voting rights. Nara watched all of it from her blankets with the satisfied expression of someone whose plan was going exactly as intended. Nobody asked her what the plan was. They probably should have. The morning after Uldren arrived, Seren woke up to find Ember sitting on his boot. Not her boot. His boot. Specifically the left one, which Ember had apparently identified as the superior boot sometime in the night and claimed accordingly. The king was already awake, sitting with his back against the shelter wall and a mug of something in his hands, looking down at the pup with an expression that was doing the specific work of not being what it clearly was. "She does that," said Seren from across the shelter, pulling herself upright. "I noticed." "You can move her. I'm aware." He did not move her. Ember, sensing the stability of her position, tucked her nose under her own tail and went back to sleep. Nara was nursing. All 5 pups, present and extremely opinionated about the arrangement. The shelter had the specific warm noise of fed animals in the early morning, low and rumbly and uncomplicated. Sissa appeared from the back passage with 2 mugs, assessed the situation at the entrance, king, boot, pup, and handed 1 mug to Seren with an expression that communicated an entire paragraph without using a single word. Seren's expression back said, "Not now." Sissa's said, "Later then. In detail." "The pups will be able to travel in 3 days," said Seren, settling on a rock with her mug and addressing Uldren with the tone of someone returning to an established subject. "Nara needs 5. After that, the move north is possible if you keep the pace easy." 5 days. He looked at the litter. Acceptable. "During which time," she continued, because the rest of the sentence existed whether she said it or not, "you and your trackers are here, in my territory." He looked at her. "Your territory." "The territory I've been maintaining for 8 days, which required significant effort." She kept her voice level. "I'm not making a legal argument. I'm establishing context." "Noted." He took a slow sip. "What does the context require from me?" It was, again, the kind of question she hadn't expected. Direct, without performance. She was starting to understand that this was just how he spoke, not tactical plainness, but the genuine habit of a man who had spent enough years in rooms full of careful language to have developed a preference for the absence of it. "Information," she said. The Eastern clans filed a notice. "I'd like to know what it actually says and what authority it carries outside their territory." "It carries advisory weight in the Northern Kingdom, not binding jurisdiction." He set down the mug. They listed you as exiled, not criminal. There's a difference in how it's received. Enough of a difference? That depends on what you do next. She looked at him steadily. He looked back. Ember, from his boot, made a small sound in her sleep that broke the beat with surgical comic timing. From across the shelter, Pero, who had been awake in the corner for probably as long as Uldren and had the professional discipline not to look like he was listening, very carefully did not smile. By midday, the sleeping lands had shifted into a version of themselves that Seren had only seen in fragments. The way the light came straight down through the canopy at noon, the specific green it turned the moss on the north-facing rocks, the sound the water source made when the wind moved in a particular direction. She had been here 8 days and had barely stopped moving long enough to notice it. She noticed it now because Uldren was beside her, and he'd gone quiet in the specific way that meant he was paying attention to something, and silence was catching. They were at the water source, 20 yards from the shelter, technically there to check that it was running clean, which it was, and which had taken 30 seconds to confirm, which meant the remaining time was something else. How long did it take to build the shelter? He asked. The original chamber, 3 weeks. The extensions, she did the math, another month, over 2 years. I had to work in pieces, small enough not to be noticed, while maintaining your Omega duties. While maintaining my Omega duties. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the lineage decree. You disagree with it. I think it answers the wrong question. She picked up a flat stone from the bank and looked at it, not throwing it, just holding it. The decree exists to protect pack strength, but it defines strength as uniformity. And I think, she set the stone back down, that uniformity is just another word for brittleness. Uldren looked at her. That's not the kind of argument the Eastern Clan Council would enjoy. No, they mentioned that. Several times. In public. A beat. Loudly. I heard it was something of a scene. I had one sandal and mud on my face and a crowd of people explaining to me that I don't belong anywhere. Her voice stayed dry. It was a whole thing. He was quiet for a moment that felt different from the others. Not assessing, not processing. Just there. You belong here, he said. Not as a statement about her future or his intentions, just as an observation about the present, the specific and simple fact that she had made something real in a place everyone else had written off. The words hung in the air between them. Seren felt their weight, not as a promise, but as a statement of fact. And what bothered her wasn't that he had said it. It was that she wanted it to be true. She looked at him. That's a fairly large thing to say on day 2. I'm aware of that. Are you always like this? Like what? Honest at inconvenient times. Something at the corner of his mouth again. I've been told it's a flaw. I've been told I keep too many animals. She looked back at the water. We all have our things. From back at the shelter, raised voices. Or not voices exactly, but the specific pitched commotion that Seren had learned to identify as Ember discovering something she shouldn't have access to. Followed by a crash that had the particular acoustic quality of something ceramic. Then Sissa's voice, patient and deeply tired. Ember, that was the medicine jar. I need you to think about what you've done. A short silence. Then Ember, apparently having thought about it, starting to howl. Seren was already moving back toward the shelter. She howls now? Said Uldren, falling into step beside her. She learned it this morning. She's very proud of herself. Should I be concerned that she sounds like she's auditioning for something? Probably not. Seren glanced at him. She does it when she's overwhelmed. It'll stop when she runs out of lung capacity, usually around 40 seconds. She looked at him without meaning to. He was already looking at her. The sound of Ember's howl filled the silence that neither of them filled. They reached the shelter at the 38-second mark. Ember was sitting in the center of the space, head tipped back, completely committed to her performance. The medicine jar was on its side, unbroken. The crash had been something else, which Seren identified as a tin cup that had fallen from the shelf. Pero was standing against the far wall with the expression of a man who has been in actual battles and is finding this specific emergency somehow more disorienting. Bolda watched Ember from his corner with the air of a faculty member observing a student presentation he hadn't been asked to grade. Nara didn't even open her eyes. Ember hit 42 seconds, ran out of breath, looked around at everyone present, apparently satisfied with the response she'd generated, and sat down. Silence. "Right," said Seren. "Mornings." "Every morning?" said Uldren. "Every morning." He looked at the tin cup on the floor, at the owl on the shelf doing her perpetual assessment of human failing, at the 5 pups nursing with the deep, unconscious peace of beings who were entirely unbothered by any of this. "I have a war room," he said, in the tone of a man processing a significant contrast. "With a very large table, very quiet." "That sounds—" She picked up the tin cup. "Genuinely restful." "It is." A pause. "Considerably less interesting, though." Sissa, passing behind Seren with fresh water, caught her eye for 1/2 second and communicated, with the efficiency of long friendship, an entire position on what was currently happening and what it meant. Seren's expression back said, "I heard you. I'm not addressing it." Sissa said, "You don't have to address it. It's addressing itself." Nara opened one eye, looked at Seren, and closed it again. Even the wolf had opinions. By nightfall of the second day, the sleeping lands had 5 wolf pups, 17 resident animals, 2 royal trackers, a general who was revising his threat assessment to include a 4-month-old pup, and a king who had extended his stay without explaining why to anyone who asked. Pero didn't ask. He had stopped asking those questions approximately 6 years into the job. He did, however, send a message north informing the council that the king was well, the wolf was recovering, and the timeline had shifted. The last line of the message read, "Situation is stable. Also, there is a bull." He felt it was relevant. The message reached the Northern Council before breakfast, which meant everybody was in the worst possible mood to receive it. Uldren had written only 2 lines. The first said the wolf and the pups were alive. The second said the situation had become inconveniently public. That was Uldren's style when he was annoyed. Controlled, spare, and just vague enough to make 9 people at a long table immediately develop opinions. By the time the council convened, the phrase "one sandal" had already spread through the castle corridors, and no one had managed to decide whether it was an insult, a joke, or a warning. At the shelter, Seren was still deciding whether to laugh or panic. She chose both, internally, which for her usually counted as calm. Nara was curled around the 5 pups with the kind of alert stillness only a mother can manage after going through something enormous and then refusing to collapse from it. The pups were tiny, pale, and loud in the way all newborn things are loud. Not through volume, but through complete commitment to being alive. Ember had appointed herself honorary border guard and had spent the morning circling the nest like a very small, very opinionated moon. Bolde had already trampled 1 fern, 2 twigs, and a political mood. "If the king comes with council papers," Sissa said, pouring water into a clay cup, "I'm leaving the territory and changing my name." "You don't know how to change your name." "I'll learn." "That's not the problem." Sissa gave her a look. It said, "Everything is the problem." Seren took the cup and looked toward the tree line. She could already feel the shift in the air that came with official attention. The sleeping lands were still quiet, still gentle, but now they had company in the form of obligations, lawyers, and people who loved the sound of their own authority too much. "They'll push for a hearing," Seren said. "Of course they will. And they'll want the shelter registered, the pups documented, the wolf classified, the territory mapped. They'll want everything turned into a file so they can feel like they understand it. Can they do that? Yes. Can we stop them? No. Sissa blew out a breath. Good morning to you too. Seren almost smiled. Almost. Then the sound came. Hooves, measured and official, at the edge of the ridge path. Not a raid, not a threat. Something more annoying. Visitors. A minute later, the first delegation appeared at the clearing. 3 council envoys in formal coats, 1 clerk with a ledger tucked under his arm, and a woman in a dark green sash who looked like she had personally trained in the art of making people feel small. Seren could tell from the set of her shoulders that she had already decided this place was either a nuisance or an embarrassment. Probably both. Sissa muttered, I hate her already, which made Seren feel oddly comforted. The woman in the sash stopped at the edge of the camp and took in the sight of the shelter, the pups, the bull, the owl, and Serene's one sandal with the slow expression of someone translating scandal into language. I am matron of the Northern Registry, she said. Her tone was crisp enough to cut paper. By order of the council, I require a complete accounting of this site. Seren stepped forward, not rushing. She'd learned that haste made people think they had power over your breathing. Seren Valda, I built the shelter. The accounting is simple. You're standing in it. Matron's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. You understand that this location is not approved for protected animal housing, and that the presence of royal line wolves complicates matters significantly. Complicates is a polite word, Seren said. I prefer makes everybody nervous. One of the envoys made a sound that might have been a cough or a laugh trying to escape. Matron ignored it. The council requires documentation of the shelter's purpose, the animal's condition, and the circumstances under which the royal wolf and the litter came under your care. In order, Seren said. I sheltered animals the clan discarded. The wolf was carried into the river by floodwater. I pulled her out. She birthed 5 pups. Everyone continued breathing. That's the version with the least drama. Matron glanced at the sleeping pups. The least drama? She repeated. I'm very committed to efficiency. Sissa, standing just behind Seren's shoulder, chose that moment to whisper, If this is efficiency, I'm terrified of your hobby. Matron heard enough of it to narrow her eyes. This is not a private matter, she said. No, Seren replied. That became obvious when the king showed up with a messenger and a very rude amount of authority. At the mention of the king, the clerk lifted his head at once, quill poised. Matron's expression sharpened. His Majesty has formally requested a council hearing. Of course he has. He is also staying in the sleeping lands. I noticed the increased foot traffic. Matron looked as though she might object to the tone, but decided it was less exhausting to pretend not to hear it. Then you'll attend the hearing. Seren actually laughed once, short and dry. I'm the one under review. Did you think I'd miss my own trial for the sake of suspense? Uldren arrived just after noon. He did not come in with ceremony. He came in with practical boots, travel dust on his coat, and the sort of expression men wear when they've ridden all morning and are already annoyed at the people they expect to find waiting. Pero followed at his shoulder, carrying the look of a man who had already formed opinions about the council and was saving them for a less delicate moment. The envoys straightened immediately. Matron dipped her head, polite enough to be real and stiff enough to be political. Uldren's eyes went first to the pups. That was the thing about him. He could be speaking to a room full of officials and still look as if some quieter, more important calculation was happening underneath the visible one. He crossed to Nara without asking permission, knelt and put one hand against the wolf's neck. Nara huffed once and accepted him with the air of a queen allowing an old acquaintance to be useful. Then he looked at Seren. She was aware, suddenly and unhelpfully, of the sandal, the damp hem of her skirt, and the fact that she had not slept enough to appear remotely majestic. Uldren's mouth moved, not quite a smile, Almost. You look disappointed, Seren said before he could speak. I'm trying to decide whether the council sent me a hearing or a hostage situation. That depends. Are you carrying a sword? Usually. Then yes. One corner of his mouth lifted fully this time. Short, involuntary, and absolutely unfairly effective. Matron cleared her throat with the polite aggression of a woman who disliked being interrupted by chemistry. Your Majesty, the Council requires a statement regarding the site, the litter, and the exiled Omega in residence. Uldren turned to her. When his face settled into full king mode, the room seemed to lose a degree or two of warmth. The exiled Omega is Seren Valda, he said. She rescued my wolf from a flooded river. She sheltered her through labor. She has also maintained a hidden refuge for rejected animals for 3 years, while performing duties under a clan that apparently mistook cruelty for order. Silence. The envoys exchanged the look of people hearing a sentence they had not been prepared to hear out loud. Uldren went on. Nara and the pups are under my protection. That is not a request. It is a fact. The clerk's quill stopped. Your Majesty, Matron said carefully, the council may question the legality of the Omega's conduct and the shelter's existence. They may question anything they like, Uldren said. They will not question the value of the lives preserved here. That landed harder than a threat. It was not loud. It did not need to be. When a king says something like that in front of witnesses, it becomes paperwork very fast. Matron recovered first, because of course she did. Then the council will convene a hearing. Fine, Uldren said. The envoys blinked at him. Fine? Matron asked. Yes, fine. Let the council convene. I'll be there. She studied him for a heartbeat, trying to determine whether this was a trap. Uldren gave her nothing. Then he turned back to Seren, and the tone changed just enough that only the people closest to him would notice. You will come too. Seren didn't answer right away. That sounded more like an order than an invitation. It's both. Charming. I'm told it's a quality. By whom? My enemies, mostly. That, unfortunately, made her laugh in spite of herself. The council hearing took place the next morning beneath the dome. The stone chamber was built for permanence, which meant every whisper echoed like it intended to become law. Seren walked in beside Sissa, with Uldren on the front bench, and Pero near the wall, looking like he'd been assigned to keep the room from becoming stupid. Bolde, for reasons no one had fully explained and no one had dared question, had been granted entrance on what the clerk called special accommodation grounds, and what everyone else quietly understood to mean, nobody wanted to argue with the king about the bull. Ember tried to follow them in and was gently blocked by a guard. She objected loudly, then sat outside the door and howled like she had been personally excluded from civilization. From somewhere behind her, Sissa murmured, "She's going to sue the council." Seren didn't smile, but only barely. Morbas presided from the central seat, face arranged into the kind of expression that had spent decades convincing people that order and morality were the same thing. Seren Valda, he said, you have been called to account for your violation of the lineage decree, the concealment of protected animals, and the establishment of an unauthorized refuge. You will answer plainly. Seren stepped forward. The silence in the room was not hostile yet, but it had teeth. I built a shelter because the clan abandoned living beings that needed care. I sheltered them because nobody else would. I hid them because I knew what would happen if the council discovered them too early. When the scouts came, I moved everyone out before any harm was done. And when the wolf was found? Morbas asked. I pulled her from a flooded river. Why? Seren looked at him as if the question was peculiar. Because she was drowning. A few people in the chamber shifted. Uldren's jaw twitched once, which for him counted as vocal agreement. Morbas folded his hands. You understand that compassion is not the same as compliance. Yes, Seren said. That is why I have one and not the other." A ripple passed through the room. Sissa made a very small noise that might have been a cough or a victory to keep from smiling. Morbus's eyes narrowed. "You admit you broke law and custom. I admit I saved lives. At the expense of structure. Structure is useful when it keeps people alive. When it doesn't, it's just furniture with a title. That got an actual reaction." A couple of counselors looked as if they'd been personally struck by a rude truth. Morbus turned to Uldren. "Your Majesty, do you intend to encourage this kind of defiance?" Uldren leaned back in his chair, comfortable in a way that was almost more threatening than anger. "I intend to encourage common sense. If the Council has a legal objection to a wolf surviving a flood, a litter being born safely, or 17 discarded animals being kept alive, then I suggest the objection is with reality, not with Seren Valda." Seren didn't look at him, because if she did, she knew her face would say something the Council shouldn't see. But she heard every word, and kept them in a place she didn't know was still empty. "She is exiled," Morbus snapped. "And yet she remains useful," Uldren replied. That quiet line cut deeper than a speech would have. Useful. Not as in obedient. Useful as in real. Necessary. Present. Morbus realized too late that he had been outflanked by the oldest kind of power, someone refusing to pretend the obvious thing wasn't true. One counselor near the back rose to speak, then another. Questions multiplied. How long had the shelter existed? Were there records? Had Seren received aid? Did the royal wolf's status alter the legal standing? Could the pups be declared protected? Could the site be mapped? Was the refuge a threat to territorial order? Seren answered each question as directly as she could. No poetry. No self-defense beyond facts. She explained how the shelter had grown in pieces, how food had been rationed, how the animals had been moved during the evacuation. She spoke about the ridge, the hidden passages, the old water source, the way the land outside the clan had been treated as dead because nobody had bothered to test whether it still wanted to live. It grew hotter in the chamber as the debate deepened. One counselor, older and more careful than the rest, asked quietly, "Were all of the animals rejected by lineage grounds?" "Not all," Seren said. "Some were simply inconvenient." That earned a few hard stares and one very involuntary snort from Pero, who turned it into a cough so badly disguised that nobody believed him. Uldren did not smile, but his eyes warmed a fraction. The hearing could have gone on much longer, but the council was forced to face a problem nobody liked. The wolf and the pups existed. The rescue was documented by royal trackers, and Uldren had placed them under protection in front of witnesses. That meant the council could punish Seren for violating process, but not for saving the lives that process had failed to value. The compromise arrived like all compromises do in chambers of power, wrapped in language, bitter in practice, and just sufficient to avoid outright revolt. Seren's exile remained on record, but the council was compelled to add a notation that her actions had preserved protected lives and that the royal wolf and litter were under temporary king's protection pending review. Uldren's signature sat beneath the clause like a blade held horizontally, not drawn, but there. Matron had the unhappy look of someone who had just realized she had lost the room and would have to explain why later. When the chamber finally emptied, Sissa let out the longest breath Seren had ever heard from her. "Well," she said, looking at the door. That was emotionally exhausting in an officially approved way. Seren looked at the sealed parchment in Uldren's hand. "So we're protected." "Temporarily," Uldren said. "But yes. And I'm still exiled." "Also, yes." "Great." He looked at her. "That sounded less optimistic than I hoped. That's because you are a king and I am one sandal away from starting a turf war with bureaucracy." For 1 second, he looked like he was trying not to laugh. He failed. It was brief, quiet. The kind of laugh that slips out when a man hasn't had enough room to be human in public and suddenly gets one. Sissa saw it and immediately turned away with the expression of a person who had just witnessed something she would weaponize later. Outside the dome, Ember was waiting with her nose shoved under the door seam, producing a muffled whine that sounded offended by procedure. When Seren stepped out, the pup threw herself at her ankles and then immediately began racing in circles around her as if filing a protest against the chamber itself. "You missed all the fun," Seren told her. Ember barked once, which in her language probably meant "I will not forget this betrayal." Uldren came out behind Seren and stood for a moment in the sunlight, looking toward the ridge where the shelter and the sleeping lands waited beyond the stone work of the kingdom. "The council will recover," he said. "From what?" "From being wrong." Seren glanced at him. "You say things like that too calmly. Practice. Terrifying. Thank you." She rolled her eyes. That seemed to amuse him more than it should have. And somewhere behind them, in the shelter below the ridge, 5 pups slept beneath their mother's warmth, while one very loud pup patrolled the perimeter like a tiny, self-appointed governor. The world had not fixed itself, but it had, for the moment, made room. By the 3rd day after the hearing, the shelter had become something dangerously close to normal. Seren was not sure she liked that. Normal meant routines. Routines meant expectations. Expectations meant people started assuming the current arrangement would last forever, and the universe had a long, documented history of punishing anyone who got comfortable. Still, there were advantages. Nara was stronger. The pups were louder. Ember had appointed herself deputy perimeter officer and spent large parts of the morning patrolling in a circle around the shelter, stopping every few minutes to investigate rocks, sniff leaves, and bark at absolutely nothing with the confidence of a creature who believed deeply in her own jurisdiction. Volda had taken over a patch of grass on the far side of the clearing and was using it as though it had been designated for him by law. The owl, Lady Frost, had moved into the higher branch of the nearest cedar and now regarded the world like a disappointed auditor. And Uldren, which was a problem of a different and far more complicated kind, had not left. That alone had changed the weather of the place. He worked alongside them during the mornings, carrying water, helping reinforce the shelter wall, and doing all of it with the mildly irritated competence of a king who had not been raised to know how to do manual labor, but had apparently decided to be good at it out of spite. He never complained, which was annoying because Seren was prepared to dislike anyone who looked dignified while hauling rock. "You're doing that wrong," she said on the 4th morning, watching him wedge a support beam into place. "I thought you were supposed to be thanking me for helping." "I'm thanking you by being useful enough to correct you." He glanced at her, then at the beam. "That's not how gratitude works." "It is if you're me." He made that almost smile again, the one that appeared first in his mouth and then, reluctantly, in his face. "You have an exhausting relationship with the concept of politeness," he said. "And you have a dangerous relationship with staying in my territory." "Your territory?" "Temporarily mine." That sounds like a complicated legal classification. Everything is complicated legally when people decide a life is inconvenient. He didn't answer right away. He just set the beam in place with a firm press and looked at the shelter, at the pups, at Nara resting in the shade. "Then let's make it inconvenient for them," he said. She felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't gratitude. It was something else, more dangerous, warmer. She decided to ignore it. Seren looked at him a beat longer than she meant to. That was the trouble with staying. It gave the bond too much time to become real in the small, ordinary moments, in the shared silence, in the way he listened instead of interrupting, in the fact that he knew when to ask and when not to. It was easier when a king was distant, harder when he carried water without being asked. That evening, while Seren was checking the pups, one of the trackers returned from the ridge with news. He came in looking unusually alert, which meant either danger or embarrassment. Seren recognized both on a face. "We found prints on the western side," he said. "Not ours, not yours. 3 sets. Light, human." They crossed into the sleeping lands and then stopped. Uldren was instantly alert. Stopped? 1 set moved back out. 2 did not. Seren's stomach tightened. "Scouts?" she asked. The tracker hesitated. "Could be. Or could be someone who didn't mean to come this far and panicked." Uldren's gaze moved toward the tree line. "No one panics and vanishes without trace in these lands unless they are hiding." That was enough. He was on his feet and already reaching for his coat. Pero, from the other side of the shelter, said, "I dislike the way you said that." Uldren ignored him. "Seren, Sissa, stay here with the pups." "That's not a suggestion," Seren said. "It absolutely wasn't." "Then you should know I'm not staying." He turned back to her. The air shifted. Not anger, not exactly. Something more controlled than anger, and therefore more dangerous. "You are not armed enough for a scouting sweep." Seren stared at him. Then she looked down at the hunting knife she'd been carrying for years, and at the king of the Northern Territory, who had just implied she was under-equipped for her own forest. "I have a knife and a very poor attitude. That has gotten me through most of my life. I'm aware. I've noticed. Then stop looking at me like I'm about to trip over a leaf and die." Sissa, behind her, made a sound that might have been a cough, but was definitely laughter trying to behave. Uldren gave Seren a long look, then sighed the way men do when they know they have lost before the argument has even finished. "Fine, but you stay close." "I always stay close. That's how competence works." That wasn't a compliment. It should have been. The tracks led into a narrow ravine beyond the western ridge, where the trees thinned and the ground dipped into a stone-lined passage that had once been part of an older road. Old enough to be forgotten by the kingdom. Old enough that the grass had reclaimed the edges and the wind moved strangely through it. Seren recognized the place halfway down. "This used to be a relay route," she said. Uldren glanced at her. "You know the old roads?" "I know the ones nobody bothers to map anymore. They're useful when you don't want to be seen." He looked at her for a fraction of a second. "Of course you do. They found the evidence at the bend. A torn strip of cloth caught in a root, light gray and finely woven. Not clan work, not traveler's common cloth either. Too clean." Sissa crouched beside it, touched the edge and frowned. "Expensive." "That helps," Seren said. "A lot of expensive things are sold in the southern market. That does not narrow it much." "You're both charmingly unhelpful," Uldren muttered. She nearly smiled. Nearly. Then Lady Frost, who had been perched far above them on a dead branch, gave a single sharp cry. All 3 of them froze. Another sound followed. Movement in the brush. Not a predator. Human. Uldren's hand lifted once. A signal, quick and precise. Pero and the tracker split to either side of the ravine. Seren stepped back half a pace, not because he told her to, but because the path narrowed and she knew how to use the terrain. The figure emerged from the stones with both hands visible. A woman. Older. Weathered travel coat. Hood up. One side of her face marked by the long healing line of an old injury. She stopped when she saw the king and looked, immediately and with no disguise, relieved, which was suspicious. "Your Majesty," she said. Uldren's expression changed, very slightly, into recognition. "Evren." Seren looked at him. "You know her." "She was a healer attached to the Eastern trade houses 5 years ago." Evren bowed her head once, but her eyes stayed on Seren, measuring. "I came because I heard the story," she said. "The wolf, the pups, the exiled Omega." "People have begun calling it a story?" Seren asked dryly. Evren's mouth twitched. "In my experience, that means it's already too late to stop the rumors." Uldren's eyes narrowed. What exactly did you hear? Enough to know someone is moving through the old road system under cover of weather and council distraction. Enough to know they're not interested in the pups. They're interested in the wolf. The ravine went still in a way Seren did not like. Uldren's voice dropped. Who? Evren hesitated only a second. Dorian Voss's people. That name hit like a stone in water. Seren looked at Uldren. He was already gone into the calculation room behind his eyes. Why are you here? He asked. Evren folded her hands. Because if Dorian's people are moving, they're looking for leverage. And if they find out the exiled Omega is the one who saved the royal litter, they'll use her story to force a hearing they can control. Seren exhaled once through her nose. Great. Wonderful. I was starting to miss direct threats. Evren glanced at her. Then don't. Back at the shelter, Nara was on her feet before they even reached the ridge. Not agitated, not panicked, alert. The pups stirred against her flank, and Ember, who had been asleep at Bolda's side for reasons only she understood, popped upright and barked at the tree line like she had been waiting all afternoon for this exact thing. That never makes me feel better, Sissa said. It's not supposed to, Seren muttered. Uldren was already scanning the clearing. Then he saw it. A small mark on the branch nearest the shelter entrance. Fresh. A coated scrape. Easy to miss unless you knew what to look for. Trackers. Not theirs. He stepped closer, expression hardening. They were here. Seren's stomach dropped. When? While we were gone. Sissa's voice went quiet. That is deeply rude. Ember was still barking, but now there was a tone to it that Seren knew. A warning, not a tantrum. Bolde lifted his head from his patch of grass and gave a slow, heavy snort in the direction of the trees. Even the bull knew something was wrong. Uldren turned to the shelter, then to the ridge, then back to the shelter. Gather the pups, he said. Now. Seren was already moving, and for the first time since arriving in the Sleeping Lands, the shelter did not feel like a secret refuge. It felt like a place people were starting to notice. The first thing Seren heard in the morning was not birds. It was Nara growling, low, controlled, not loud enough to wake the whole shelter, but enough to snap Seren fully alert in 1 second flat. She was on her feet before the thought had finished forming. Sissa was already awake, which meant she had heard it too. Uldren was standing by the entrance, one boot on, one boot half-laced, and a look on his face that said whatever was outside the shelter, he already disliked it intensely. Then Seren heard the second thing. A voice. Not close enough to understand, but human, and not one she recognized. Uldren moved first, stepping outside the shelter with the quiet precision of a man who had spent his whole life learning how to enter danger before it entered him. Seren followed, knife in hand, Sissa right behind her with the kind of expression people wear when they have already accepted that the day is about to become somebody else's problem. At the edge of the clearing, 3 figures stood in the mist. Not council, not trackers, travelers. Except they were too well dressed for travelers and too still for merchants. The one in front was a man in a gray traveling cloak with expensive buttons and a face Seren immediately distrusted because it had been built too carefully. Next to him stood a younger woman with the guarded posture of someone trying not to look like she was here on purpose. And between them, not between literally, but in the way the room rearranges around certain people, was Dorian Voss. Seren had seen paintings of him once in the Eastern archives, long ago, when she was still young enough to believe books contained all the world's important truths. He looked like the version of a man people commission when they want authority to seem handsome. Dark hair at the temples, smooth voice, eyes with enough patience to be mistaken for kindness if you weren't paying attention. She did not like him on sight. He smiled anyway. Your Majesty, he said to Uldren, with enough courtesy to be offensive. Thank you for receiving us. Uldren didn't move. You were not invited. Dorian spread his hands slightly. And yet here I am. The council asked me to consult on the matter of the litter and the refuge. The council did no such thing, Seren said. Dorian's eyes moved to her at last. He studied her like someone considering a tool and trying to decide if it could be repurposed. You must be Seren Valda. She gave him a blank look. The name is doing a lot of work right now, yes. The woman beside him glanced sideways, possibly to hide a smile. Seren noticed. Filed it. Dorian inclined his head. I've heard your story. It is, I admit, unusual. I'm thrilled to have made your day interesting. He ignored that, which told her he was competent, and therefore worse than the ones who react badly. The council is concerned about the implications of 5 royal pups being born in the care of an exiled Omega, he said. It creates administrative confusion. That's an excellent way to describe someone nearly drowning in a river, Seren said. Administrative confusion. His smile thinned almost invisibly. I'm only here because your act of rescue has consequences beyond your personal intentions. So do your visits, apparently. Uldren stepped forward once. The air changed immediately. Say what you came to say, he said. Dorian's gaze shifted to Nara, who stood just inside the shelter entrance now, with the pups curled tight against her side. Her eyes were on him with a deep and terrible stillness that needed no translation. For the first time, Dorian looked less comfortable. Good. Very well, he said. The council is considering a formal transfer of the litter into the custody of the crown. Given the unusual circumstances of their birth and the instability surrounding their relocation, it would be prudent. Seren blinked slowly. You want to take them? I want to ensure their future, Dorian corrected. The kingdom requires clarity, and, if I may be blunt, the exiled Omega's continued presence complicates succession messaging. Uldren's jaw tightened. Seren's mind did one clean, silent, awful turn. Not the pups, not Nara, not in custody. She stepped forward before she'd fully decided to. They are not a messaging problem. Dorian looked at her with patience so polished it was almost contempt. The kingdom does not run on sentiment. No, Seren said. It runs on people like me keeping the things you label inconvenient alive. The woman beside Dorian glanced toward Uldren, then back at Seren, and the tiniest crease appeared between her brows. Recognition? Doubt? Seren didn't know, but she saw it. Uldren's voice was level and cold. If the council moves to remove the litter without cause, I will reject the motion. Dorian's expression remained smooth, but the temperature in the clearing dropped by a degree. That would be an unfortunate precedent, Your Majesty. Then don't set it. Dorian's gaze shifted to the shelter again, to Nara, to the pups. You have grown attached, he said quietly. Uldren's silence was answer enough. The man smiled, not kindly. Attachment is useful. It makes choices clearer when the time comes. Seren hated him more in that moment than she had thought possible. And then Sissa, from behind her shoulder, said in a voice of absolute calm, If you came all this way just to be ominous in the grass, you should know the grass is winning. A beat of silence. The woman beside Dorian choked once, quickly, on what was probably a laugh. Dorian turned his head slightly toward her, then toward Sissa. He had been prepared for hostility. He had not been prepared for humor. That was useful. Because the next thing Seren noticed, the thing that snapped the world into sharper focus, was that the woman beside Dorian was no longer looking at the shelter. She was looking at Nara, and she looked afraid. Not of the wolf, for the wolf. Which meant she knew something nobody had said out loud yet. The shelter went very still. Uldren saw it too. Seren could feel it in the way his attention shifted, just a fraction, from Dorian to the woman beside him. Dorian noticed the change. His smile remained in place. His eyes, however, did not. And in that instant, Seren knew the visit was not only about the pups, it was about what Dorian had brought with him. And whatever it was going to complicate everything. That night, Seren couldn't sleep. Not because of Dorian, because at some point between sunset and full dark, Uldren had rested his shoulder against hers while they watched the valley. And she hadn't moved away. Hadn't even thought about moving away. That scared her more than any enemy. By the time the last snow of the season started to melt, the sleeping lands no longer felt like a temporary refuge. They felt claimed. That was the word Seren kept coming back to, even though she disliked how legal it sounded. Claimed, not conquered, not occupied, not borrowed. Claimed in the quieter, older sense of a place recognizing who had been willing to stay when staying had been hard. The first spring rain softened the ridges around the shelter and turned the moss bright again. The water source behind the cedars ran clear and cold. The path to the river, once used only by Seren and Sissa and the occasional exasperated bull, had widened under the weight of repeated foot traffic until it looked almost intentional. Lady Frost had nested in the highest cedar and now viewed everyone with the indifference of an elder who had seen a social hierarchy fail and was waiting for the next one to do the same. Ember, now less of a pup and more of a one-animal disaster, had become a permanent fixture in the clearing. She had opinions about all visitors, all food portions, and all decisions involving doors. If a person entered the shelter without being barked at by Ember first, Seren considered that a security failure. Volda, who had once merely tolerated the chaos, had become its unofficial supervisor. He no longer just stood in the grass like a politician thinking hard. He had a routine now. He inspected the perimeter every morning, accepted herbs from Seren with the air of a creature doing her a favor, and once, had allowed Ember to climb onto his back and ride for a full 20 seconds before sighing so deeply that even the trees seemed to apologize. And Nara, no longer the wolf who had been dragged from a river and carried into the sleeping lands half-broken and near labor, had become the quiet center of the shelter's life. She kept close to the pups, of course. They were no longer helpless, not really, though they remained young enough to treat every small change in weather like a major political event. They were growing fast, all 5 of them, each with a shape of personality Seren could now recognize at a glance. The firstborn, pale and steady, was calm in a way that made everyone trust him before he'd done anything to earn it. The second was the clown, forever rolling into places she shouldn't, and emerging as if she had planned the maneuver. The third watched before acting, which made her seem older than the others. The fourth had no patience for waiting, and the fifth, the smallest, still the stubborn one, believed deeply that the world should accommodate her immediately. Seren had stopped giving them temporary names. Everyone else had not. "That one is Trouble," Sissa said one morning, watching the smallest pup attempt to drag an apple larger than her head across the dirt. "That narrows it down to all of them," Seren replied. "No, that one specifically. She has your eyes." Seren snorted. "That's unfair to both of us." Sissa smiled in that dry way she had, the smile that always said she'd won the exchange whether she had or not. Then she handed Seren a bundle of newly dried herbs and pointed toward the ridge path. "You have company." Seren looked up. Uldren was coming down the path with Pero, one carrying a rolled document case and the other carrying the expression of a man who had spent 3 months watching his king become permanently attached to a hidden valley full of animals and had decided that whatever happened next would not surprise him. It still surprised him, Seren thought, just not enough to be rude about it. She stood, dusted her hands, and waited. Uldren reached the clearing, stopped in front of her, and handed over the document case. "It's official," he said. Seren opened it. Inside were the council's final decrees, written plainly and sealed properly. Her exile had been formally reviewed. her actions at the shelter and the river documented, and the record amended to state that the lives preserved under her care constituted protected kin under royal sanction. Protected kin. She stared at the phrase for a long moment. They use that language? She asked. They resisted using it. Then they lost the argument. That sounds like you. It was mostly Matron. Seren looked up. The woman who thought I was a problem? The same. He took a breath, then went on before she could ask. She changed her mind after she saw the pups, and after she heard the account of the shelter, and after she realized the council could either adapt or become a museum of bad judgment. Sissa, from behind Seren, muttered, "That's the nicest thing anyone has ever said about bureaucracy." Uldren's mouth moved, not quite a smile, definitely one for Sissa. "The ruling is done," he said. "Your exile is lifted. Officially." Seren felt the words settle in her chest with a strange, quiet weight. Lifted. Not because the old clan had suddenly become wise, not because Morbus had grown a conscience, but because truth had survived long enough to become paperwork. "And the shelter?" she asked. "Recognized under the crown as a sanctuary site. Protected. Permanently." That one hit harder than she expected. She looked toward the shelter, toward the pups, toward Nara, who had emerged from the shade and was watching them all with that same clean, steady dignity she had carried ever since the river. "Permanently," Seren repeated. "Permanently." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the smallest pup, as if sensing a gap in the emotional structure of the conversation, grabbed a loose strip of cloth from one of Serene's storage bundles and sprinted off with it. Ember immediately gave chase. Bold snorted once in resignation. Lady Frost, from her cedar perch, watched the chaos with the expression of a creature who had long ago accepted that birds and wolves were not the most disruptive species in the valley. Seren laughed. Quietly at first, then fully. It wasn't the laugh of relief alone. It was the laugh of someone who had spent too long being told a thing was impossible and had finally outlived the people who said it. Uldren watched her with an expression that had become familiar over the past months. Not possession, not even longing exactly, though that lived there too. It was something steadier and much more dangerous, because it had become ordinary. He had become part of the landscape of her life. That was the true surprise. Not that he had fought for the shelter, not that he had defied the council, not that he had signed the decree that made her safe. The surprise was that when he stood near her now, the world made sense. She looked at him. "You're staying," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "With the shelter?" "Yes." "With me?" That time he answered with no hesitation at all. "Yes." The word was so simple it nearly undid her, not because she doubted him, because he had made the choice aloud. Clear. Conscious. Not because the bond demanded it, not because the circumstances required it, not because the kingdom needed a king to choose wisely for once, because he wanted to. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. But he didn't say anything. He just stood there, waiting, as if he had all the time in the world, as if she was worth the wait. That mattered more than destiny ever could. Serene looked away first because she needed 1 second to arrange her face back into something functional. "You know," she said, recovering enough to sound dry again. "Most kings bring flowers when they want to court someone. I brought legal reform. Extremely romantic." "I thought so." Sissa made a sound that was dangerously close to a laugh and very nearly backed away before being noticed. Uldren glanced at the shelter, then at Seren. "There's one more matter." "Of course there is. The wolf's litter." Seren turned back fully now. "What about them?" "They're being recognized individually under the crown. Each pup. Each with royal protection and shelter status. Once they're old enough, they'll be given the option to remain here, travel north, or do both? Seren stared at him. You negotiated adoption rights for wolf pups. I negotiated future options. That's adoption rights with a crown seal. He looked at her calmly. I was trying to keep the phrasing dignified. Sissa openly laughed this time. Even Nara, from the shelter entrance, gave a low exhale that sounded suspiciously like amusement. Serene pinched the bridge of her nose. I have no idea how to live in a world where the king says things like future options about babies and expects that to be emotionally stable. Uldren's expression softened. You won't have to do it alone. There it was. The thing beneath all the official language, all the decrees, all the decisions. Not just protection, belonging. The shelter had been Serene's secret, then her burden, then her cause. Now it was becoming her home. And Uldren, with his quiet patience, his irritating ability to carry things without complaint, his infuriating talent for saying exactly the right thing when she least expected it, was not standing outside it. He was inside the life she had built. That was the choice he had made. That was the choice she made back. She crossed the clearing and stopped in front of him, close enough to see the tiredness in the corners of his eyes, the way leadership had shaped him and worn him at once. Then she reached up, took the front of his coat in both hands, and kissed him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't brief either. It was warm and certain and real, the kind of kiss that carries no surprise, because both people had already stopped pretending this was only practical. When she pulled back, Uldren looked at her with the rare, stunned expression of someone who had just been granted something he expected to have to negotiate for. That was... he began. Don't say unexpected, Seren warned. His mouth twitched. I was going to say welcome. She laughed. That's worse. I'm learning. Around them, the shelter continued its usual chaos with absolutely no respect for the emotional moment. The smallest pup tripped over Ember. Ember yelped. Bolde moved exactly 1 inch to the left to avoid being involved. And Lady Frost let out a single offended cry from her cedar branch as if to say that romance was all well and good, but the noise level had become intolerable. Seren looked at the shelter, at Nara, at the pups, at Sissa, who was pretending not to smile and failing magnificently, at Pero, who had the expression of a man witnessing the completion of a long and exhausting arc, and was glad none of it was his direct responsibility. Then at Uldren. Stay for dinner, she said. Was that an invitation? Don't make it weird. I'm a king. Everything is weird. That got her again. Every time. The sun tilted lower over the ridge, and the sleeping lands glowed gold in the late light. The old paths had become lived-in paths. The shelter had become a sanctuary. The exiled Omega had become the woman who saved the royal wolf. The royal wolf had become the mother of 5 pups whose futures were no longer threatened by a council's fear. And the king, who had arrived carrying the language of decrees and duty, had chosen to remain because he wanted a life that could be touched, not just governed. Seren looked around once more and felt the answer settle fully into her bones. This was not a story about being chosen by fate. It was a story about choosing back. Epilogue. 2 years later, the shelter on the sleeping lands had grown into a proper refuge, with timber supports, new chambers, and a broader path wide enough for wagons, visitors, and the occasional overconfident bull. The council still complained, of course. Councils always do. But they complained from a distance, and with paperwork. Seren had become the keeper of the valley shelter, officially recognized, diplomatically irritating, and personally impossible to replace. She taught healing. She taught rescue work. She taught the value of giving every living thing the room to become what it was meant to be. Nara stayed by her side, older now, slower in the hips but no less dignified. Her pups had grown into strong young wolves with their own stubbornness, their own humor, and their own ideas about the world. One had become a tracker. One had become a healer. One had become the terror of 3 villages and a beloved favorite of the cookhouse. The smallest, the one with Seren's eyes, had become the first to volunteer for anything dangerous, which Seren had predicted and resented in equal measure. Uldren came and went between the kingdom and the valley, though everyone knew where he belonged when he could choose. He and Seren built something that was not ruled by title or mercy alone, but by the daily decision to stay, to listen, to hold space for each other's work, and to keep choosing the life that made room for joy. The sleeping lands no longer slept. They flourished. And every spring, when the first rain came and the river ran clear again, Seren would stand at the bank with Uldren beside her, look out over the valley, and think how close she had once come to being erased by people who called themselves keepers of order. Instead, she had become the thing they couldn't control, a home that survived.